You're listening to Building the Broncos with Nick Kendell and Carl Dumler, Broncos country's leading draft and scouting analysts. Get on over to milehighhuddle.com to sound off on all things Broncos.
Hello there, Broncos country, and it is once again time for another episode of Building the Broncos. I am your host, Carl Dumler, and with me, as always, I have my co-host and good friend, Mr. Nick Kendell. Nick, how are you doing out there, buddy?
Hey, can't complain. You know, Mother's Day was good. Got to go back and see the mom. Her and the fiance, the two most important women in my life, and got a car appointment today too. So just checking things off the list and moving forward and starting to get a little bit of an itch for football. We're back in OTAs and everything, but really want some new tape to grind. I might start the 2020 class here pretty darn soon.
I think you'd be proud of me. I started watching the wide receiver class already.
Oh my gosh, Carl, I bet you're getting the shakes.
Oh, just a little bit. I had somebody that didn't know who Jerry Jeudy was the other day, and I was like, oh my gosh, I got to show you this guy. So very, very, very excited. But we're also here real quick. We are joined by Mark Schofield. And I say this every time, he is a Pats fan, but we don't hold that too much against him. But this guy, he knows football. He knows the quarterback position. He also writes for Inside the Pylon, Pro Football Weekly, Pat's Pulpit, The Big Blue View. Are there any other people you're writing for right now, Mark?
There's a couple more, but really, his title is titles. It doesn't matter. It's always just a pleasure to be with you guys.
First of his name.
First of my name,
Breaker of the pocket.
And all that. Breaker of the pocket. Yeah, I love that. No, but it's great to be with you guys as always. Always fun chatting with you.
We love it, and we're excited for the topic we're going to be talking about here today because it's the make or break of how the Broncos season is going to go and possibly even the future of the franchise. But before we do that, I want to make sure that you can find us on Twitter. You can find me at Carl Dumler MHH, and you can find Nick at Nick Kendell MHH, and you can find Mark at Mark Schofield. You can follow the podcast Twitter account at BTB Football Pod, and make sure you subscribe to our show and leave us a rating as we value your input. You can find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, and even that of YouTube. Also, make sure you head over to Mile High Huddle, an affiliate of 24/7 Sports and the CBS Sports Digital, to find ours and our co-writers' articles and all things pertaining to your Denver Broncos. Also, if you enjoy our show, make sure you head on over and leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes, where Building the Broncos along with Huddle Up are found under the Huddle Up podcast. This podcast is powered by Overtime Media. Well, Mark, it seems like every time we have you on our show, it's because the Broncos can't seem to figure out this stupid quarterback position. and so we're glad to have you back because, the Broncos have maybe changed their quarterback room more than any other team in the NFL this year. They might not even have a quarterback on the roster that was on the roster last year. And so I'm excited to kind of hear what you have to say about we got Drew Lock, but we also have Joe Flacco, Brett Rypien, and just kind of where they're going, what you see with that, and have they figured out the quarterback room. But let's start with the draft pick, because this is the new shiny toy in Denver. Everybody's tweeting about him. As Nick said, OTAs have started, and here's this kid. Everybody's excited to watch him, see what he can do. Everybody's talking about how fast his fastball is just amazing. All those kind of things. And so I wanted to get your little bit of input on this kid because we got a guy that has a lot of film out there, 4-year starter in the SEC, owns the SEC single season passing touchdown record, 44 touchdowns in last year, first team all SEC in 2017, second team in 2018, team captain, and of course, second round pick for the Broncos. What do you see when you're seeing a guy like Drew Lock? What kind of strengths are we looking at for him?
Well, you sort of touched on it. The easy one, the one that sort of jumps out at you, whether you're watching him on tape or down in person, like I did at the Senior Bowl, it's the arm talent. He has what I call sort of easy velocity. He doesn't need perfect mechanics, perfect footwork, a perfect throwing base under him to deliver throws to all levels of the field with absolutely impressive velocity. And that is something that the more that I have done this, the more that I have evaluated quarterbacks. I used to be somebody that wasn't totally sold on arm strength as sort of a requirement. But the more I do this, the more I realize that enables you to have a much different learning curve than, say, other quarterbacks, because you can make up for, say, a lack of process and speed or slower mental development with absolute incredible arm talent. And a prime example was Josh Allen last year. You look at how people viewed him coming out. He was certainly a quarterback I was not that high on, but the ability to throw with velocity enables you to make some throws later than other quarterbacks. And that enables you to take a little bit longer reading the defense. And if you need to do that, whether because you're still learning the offense or because of your developmental curve or for whatever reason, the fact that you can still drop the hammer is going to get you out of some sticky situations. And so that's certainly an impressive trait of his that I think will definitely help him as he develops. As I watched him sort of over the course of the past couple of years, you can see him starting to refine a bit. And I think this was most evident more than anywhere else down at Mobile for the Senior Bowl. And the way he approached that week, handled that week, and performed that week was a factor in my evaluation. He was my QB3 in this class. It wasn't a big factor, but I certainly kept it in mind because let's not forget, he went into this week down to the Senior Bowl with some high expectations. People thought he might have been the best quarterback down there, or at least the second best. And he sort of lived up to that hype, whereas Daniel Jones, who did end up getting drafted in the first round, I don't think did. And I think that speaks volumes to how he's going to approach life as a professional. And you also saw improved mechanics, refined mechanics, cleaner mechanics down in Mobile. And so that gets to sort of the coachability with him, which I think is going to be critical for his development, particularly because of some of the comments we've heard in the past 24 hours or so from the assumed starting quarterback. And we can get into that a little bit later. But I think when you put that together, you have the arm talent, you have the sort of coachability. You have some of the growth we've seen in the past couple of years with him, which I know we're going to talk about. And I think it bodes well for him as he learns to become a professional quarterback. Now, there are some weaknesses to his game. And the first 3 years while he was at Missouri, it was a very Baylor-esque offense. That's how I described it in my notes a couple of years ago when I was watching his 2016 tape. It seemed like every throw was a hitch route, a comeback route, a go route with some tunnels, the occasional corner route, the occasional slant route. It was a very boundary, like numbers into the outside kind of offense. He had some sloppy footwork at times, but he wasn't on run-pass option designs. His offense was filled with sort of half-field reads, and he would still stare down some routes at times. And you saw him over the past couple of years refine some of that stuff. The Derek Dooley offense last year challenged him to make more middle-of-the-field throws. The footwork, as I said, looked better, down at Mobile for the Senior Bowl. Earlier in his career, he sort of loved the fastball, relied on it, and you saw him develop some more touch over the past couple of years. And so I think when you put it together, you see a quarterback that obviously has some raw tools, and there's a lot to work with, but they're still going to need some development over the next year or so before we can assume him becoming a starting quarterback.
And I wanted to ask you about that over the next year because there's a really good chance he's not the starter. I think the Broncos are pretty well comfortable with Joe Flacco being the guy this year. If you were his quarterback's coach, offensive coordinator, what would you have him focusing on for this next year?
Well, I think there's two main areas where he needs to sort of show that improvement. And one is sort of a blanket that all rookie quarterbacks are going to need to refine, and that's sort of the speed with which you're making decisions. And that's going to be a task for him that might be tougher than some of the other quarterbacks because of the offensive styles of systems that he's played in. First you have the Baylor offense, and then with Dooley, you had more stuff over the middle, but it was still primarily a boundary offense. You can't survive in the National Football League as an offense when every throw or 70% of the throws are outside the numbers. You're going to have to challenge the middle of the field at times. And so that gets into sort of the process and speed and how he can quickly decipher and diagnose what a defense is doing and then making the right decision with the football. And so all rookies need to get faster, and Locke's curve might be a little bit steeper than some of the other guys in this class, whether they were drafted ahead of him or behind him. So that's one area. I mean, and the other area is the mechanics, and it's not a massive concern, but it is a concern because my thought on mechanics has always been they don't matter until they matter, which is a shorthand way of saying if the ball is getting where it's supposed to be, when it's supposed to be there, I don't care how the quarterback throws it, like behind his legs, around his head, behind his back. I don't care as long as it's not impacting the structure and design of the play. But when the ball isn't getting where it's supposed to be, when it's supposed to be there, then it tends to be an issue. And at times that did pop up with Locke, there were times when he would rely on his arm a bit too much inside of an offshoot of this, and the ball wouldn't get to be where it's supposed to be because he's waited a bit too long because he thinks he could just live and die by his arm, and that would impact the overall structure and execution of a play. There were some times when the mechanics, the foot wouldn't be set, and it did sort of lead to an errant throw. And so they need to be refined a bit, but he's already, in the process of doing that. So those are two areas. A third I will mention is manipulation. And, this is something I know we're going to talk about a little bit later with one of the other guys, but you have to be able, as an NFL quarterback, to move defenders out of position. It's a prerequisite to success, because if you're just allowing guys to spot drop against you and read your eyes and you can't move them out of position, you're going to have a tough time creating and throwing windows and then exploiting them. You have to be able to move defenders out of position, whether it's a free safety in the middle of the field, the underneath hole linebacker, and a cover one scheme underneath, and you're trying to throw that slant route. And that's something he wasn't tasked with doing a ton while at Missouri. And so he's going to need to develop that over the next year or so. So those are the three areas I would sort of focus on: that process and speed issue, the mechanical refinement, and of course, the ability to move defenders with his eyes.
I do think on that last point, he showed that a little bit more this past season. I felt like his junior year, that middle of the field safety, screw it. I'm going to chuck it. My arm can get there. My guy will outrun it. And this last year, I felt like I saw him use his eyes and his head a lot more, and that opened up plays down the sideline for guys like Emmanuel Hall.
Yeah, that was definitely something, and I think that was some of the Dooley influence, because you're getting a coach that has coached in the National Football League that knows that, look, you can't live and die with bird dog and routes left and right. You're going to have to move guys. And so, and also with Dooley's offense, with more routes in the middle of the field at times, that gives you sort of that natural, manipulation. And this is something I wrote about and talked about with Kyler Murray, because sometimes you have to use scheme to force the quarterback to use his eyes. When you have to read a route in the middle of the field and then go to the outside, you're naturally going to move your eyes to the middle of the field before you get to the outside. And so that's one way to sort of manufacture manipulation. And I think Skaggs might have to do that with him. You might be just a fraction of running an NFL offense, but that's a way to sort of train the eyes as he develops that ability. And then once he gets up to speed with the playbook and the route concepts and reading the coverages, then he'll be able to do it a little bit more naturally.
And I do have a question for you about this past year compared to years previously. I spoke with his quarterback coach, Jordan Palmer, at the Missouri Pro Day, and he talked about just, Locke is a pretty good athlete for the quarterback position. He can move around, and you see that, but Palmer stated that he thought that in the heavier RPO system that they had, the Baylor offense, as you were calling it, that Locke would tended to get a little bit stiff and rigid with his mechanics and his movement, and just loosening him up, letting him play a little bit more freely, and marrying that the pro style footwork that he had in the Dooley offense really was a big reason to. You saw him kind of improve this past season, especially down the stretch. I think he had a 6-game stretch. It was after the Alabama and Georgia games where, he was just on fire, statistically speaking, making great throws, et cetera. He wasn't playing the cream of the crop of the SEC at that point, but still looked like things changed around. Is there something else that you saw? Is that something you also saw kind of his junior to senior year as far as the fluidity and just how the footwork, he changed his footwork later in the season?
Yeah, I think that's, that's a great point by you, and of course by Jordan as quarterback's coach. And I think you sometimes see that stiffness, that rigidity, when you almost take on the mold of what we would call a task-oriented quarterback. And sometimes in these RPO type systems, you're thinking, okay, I have to do so much here where I'm reading this guy, I'm keying this defender, I'm running the mesh point, I'm reading the eyes, and then I have to pull it in and throw it. And you're so focused on the task in front of you that you become almost stiff and robotic in response. And there's not that natural flow to a 3-step drop or a 5-step drop or even a 1-step drop from the gun. And so I think getting them out of that sort of structure of offense, and like you said, sort of the language you use there, sort of freeing him up a bit, enabled him to have sort of a really nice closeout to his senior campaign. And, people had sort of, and the ebbs and flows of sort of the draft evaluation process are such that people get bumped up and moved up, and then people shy away from them when they have a couple of bad games. And those Alabama and Georgia games were some tough games. But at the same time, you still saw flashes of what he can do. One of his better throws last year was that deep crossing route against Alabama for a touchdown. He had all day to throw it. but still you could see him sort of loosely moving around, staying on the balls of his feet in that ready position, and then just throws an absolute strike to the back left corner of the end zone when his receiver sort of breaks across the back line. And that shows you the arm talent there. And so I think freeing him up a little bit, just letting him play a little bit. Sometimes you need to do that with younger quarterbacks, and that certainly helped close out his senior year the way he did.
Well, and he did talk about his game kind of comparing himself to Aaron Rodgers and wanting that freedom to do some things like that. And he says he doesn't want to do that all the time, which is a good answer, but he does know that he can do that kind of thing. So it's kind of nice. I think when you're trying to marriage a player to a scheme, I think one of the best things for the Broncos is with Rich Scangarello, where he wants to get his quarterbacks sometimes out of the pocket, get them to the outside, get them to the sidelines, and let them go make some plays either with their feet or with their arm. I think that is kind of a nice marriage between those two.
Yeah, I think so too. I think when you look at what we anticipate this Broncos offense to look like, especially when you assume that it's going to be a Joe Flacco offense in a sense, there's going to be a lot of pocket movement. There's going to be a lot of getting the quarterback outside of the pocket at times, using those tight ends. Obviously, with the first round draft pick you guys have, you can expect him to be used, Noah Fant, a lot. And I think that is an offense that will kind of fit with where Locke wants to be and where he's most comfortable. Look, if it were me and I were going to sit down and design an offense for Drew Lock himself, obviously I would want to have a lot of vertical elements to it. I think you want to take advantage of the arm talent. You want to take advantage of his willingness to make some throws downfield. He has the arm to do it, and he has the appropriate level of aggression to do that. So you're going to want to have some vertical concepts, your sails, your mills, over the middle of the field, the post and the dig, or sail with the go and the deep out to the outside. You're going to want to have some smash elements too, where he can throw that corner route, one of the tougher routes to throw, but he has the arm talent and the trajectory to do that. But I think you're still going to want to move him out of the pocket at times. You're going to want to use him on boot elements, use some of the athleticism that he has. He's probably an above average athlete for the quarterback position, so you might as well take advantage of that. And so I think you can see elements of where we expect the Broncos to be fit in with his game. But I do think that as the offense sort of becomes more of a Drew Lock and less of a Joe Flacco offense, although Flacco does have, arm talent and the willingness to push the ball downfield, I think you will see more vertical elements come into play, because that's probably where he's at his best. Drew Lock is pushing the ball downfield, to the outside as well as deep down the middle of the field.
And I have one more question before we get on to some weaknesses here, but how much does the extra stuff count for the quarterback? Obviously we're more film guys. We don't really know Drew Lock, but going down the pro day, it was striking to just, you can almost feel his presence. He's going around and he's joking with every player's mother and like the scouts that he's met once, and, they're talking like they have an inside joke. And it's really just this is very obviously a outsider perspective, but it's the contrast between him and like a guy like Paxton Lynch. How much does that need to be weighed into when you're evaluating these quarterbacks? Because I probably outside of the coach, that guy's the culture bringer for the team. He's got to be kind of just radiating that energy and that aura. And obviously, we saw it with Baker Mayfield this last year, and he looks like he could be one of the best young quarterbacks in football. And then there was questions about it in the opposite end with Josh Rosen, and now he's on a new team. Granted, different kind of interesting circumstances there, but are you picking up any of that with Drew Lock, and how much of that does that matter to you when you're evaluating this position?
Absolutely. I'm absolutely getting that sort of sense from him. And, what's interesting about evaluating players sort of from the outside is we get such a small piece of the information available to teams. We basically get film and then whatever exposure we're lucky to get with them, whether it's chatting with them down at the Senior Bowl or a pro day or seeing them interviewed at the combine, or maybe you're lucky enough to get them on a podcast. But that's tough with quarterbacks because they're in such high demand. But we have such a small sliver of information available to us, whereas John Elway could have called up any of Drew Lock's former and current coaches, or he could have called up high school coaches. He could have called up kids and asked them if they went to his birthday party. They could have had they have all this information available to them. And of course they get the chance to sit down with these guys and watch film and put them on the whiteboard and all of that stuff, see them, how they interact with people at their pro day, like you pointed out. But playing quarterback, when you're evaluating other positions, like say you're studying a running back or a wide receiver or a tight end, it's sort of a snap to whistle type thing. It's like, does the guy do his job during the course of a play? Quarterback is such a different beast. Sometimes I've called it a huddle to whistle position because you have to account for what they're doing in the pre-snap phase. But even that sells it short. It's a 24-hour, 365 job because the leadership aspect of playing the quarterback position is something we can't undersell. When you get into that huddle, you got 10 sets of eyes looking back at you, wanting you to lead them. When you make a mistake, how do you respond to that? When the chips are down, how do you lead your team through those kind of moments? And that has nothing to do with the kind of athlete you are, the kind of fastball you can throw, or the kind of routes you can read. That has everything to do with character. And playing quarterback in some sense is entirely about character. How you lead other men, and as a rookie, how you will lead guys that have been playing for years, guys that have been playing for maybe a decade in the National Football League. How are they going to respond to you? How will they respect you? And so it's a massive part of the evaluation process that we on the outside sometimes don't get a full and complete picture of. But I think when you look at, say, a Baker Mayfield, and he's a perfect example of this, because if you were watching that Thursday night game, it was night and day. It was night and day, that stadium, that team, that sideline, that huddle, when Tyrod Taylor came off and Baker Mayfield went in. I mean, you could just tell watching on television. I remember that next morning, my parents, who are huge football fans, they came over to take my daughter out for ice cream or something. They just came and they were like, it's a completely different team when he's out there. I mean, they could see it. Anybody could see it watching that game. And so you're going to need that ability to electrify and lead and inspire those around you. And so however you can glean that ability from a person, whether it's in talking to them, seeing them interact with other people, sometimes just looking at what they were able to do while in college, you have to be able to figure out, can they do this or not? Because the ability to throw a football, yeah, it's part of the puzzle, but it's not even half the puzzle. You've got to bring so much more to the table, and leadership is certainly a part of that.
Yeah, I think I told you this before, of being down at the Senior Bowl when Baker Mayfield walked on the field. Yeah. And I mean, the players, the coaches, the media, everybody just turned and stared.
Yeah.
I mean, he had that kind of personality. Even Josh Allen gravitated towards him. And here's a top 10 pick quarterback, and he's gravitating towards this guy.
Yeah, I mean, you knew when Baker was at Lad Peebles, the air was just different. And I mean, that year, he was late, his mom was sick, and so there was some uncertainty about when he was going to arrive. And when he finally did, it was like, Baker's here. And you could feel the energy in the stadium. And so the great ones sort of deliver on that. And that's something you need to bring to the table. I mean, obviously time will tell whether Drew Lock can replicate some, maybe not all, but maybe some of that. But if he can, that's a huge thing for a young quarterback to deliver on.
So my next question, I guess, now is kind of switching over to those weaknesses side of things. You've already hit on some of them a little bit and what he needs to work on this year. But why do you think he fell in the draft? Because you said you had him ranked number 3. A lot of people didn't have him leaving the top 10, top 15 kind of picks in the draft. And there he was, pick 42. What happened there?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, it's interesting to do this show with you guys right now because there are 2 quarterbacks who I am dying to figure out why they fell the way they did, because they were my guys 3 and 4. And one is Drew Lock and the other is Brett Rypien. I mean, Brett Rypien was like QB4 in this class. And, I knew with Rypien, and we can get into that a little bit later, that there was going to be a massive divergence between how myself and others viewed him and how the league viewed him. And it turns out there was that big divergence. Well, Lock, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it was a sort of a function of the teams that addressed it the way that they did. And so other teams probably looked at the way their boards were and they said, okay, well, look, this is maybe our QB3, QB4 dependent, but we have other positions that we just need to address. And so it's just a situation with the way the board fell for Locke. He was just sort of that. It was like a game of musical chairs. There were 3 chairs and 4 quarterbacks. And it just so happened that he was QB4 on the outside looking in. And in some sense, though, that might be the best thing to happen to him. Because it's one thing if you get picked at 10, there's going to be a set of expectations that we want to see you on the field sooner rather than later. And there's going to be a set of expectations that come with that first-round draft choice. I mean, look, I write for Big Blue View. I know all about trying to temper expectations for the second quarterback to come off the board because I wrote a piece that night when he was drafted. I wrote a piece about what to expect for Daniel Jones in his mini camp, and they were just ratioed the tweets, putting those pieces out with people being, how can you set the expectations so low? Like, he's a 6th overall pick. Like, he has to be great right away. And it's like, if you get drafted at 10, expectations are going to be somewhat similar. But now when you come off the board in the 40s, there's this more understanding nature that comes with that. And that's going to be a good thing for him because it will allow Denver to sort of bring him along on a much more appropriate time frame. They won't have to rush him on the field. There won't be pressure from ownership or the front office that we're going to get this guy on the field because the fans are clamoring for it. You know, if Joe Flacco plays okay at the start, there won't be this like rush to the airwaves to say we got to get the other guy in. Now, if Flacco is awful out of the gate, then maybe that happens, but that would have happened either way. You know, there won't be this need to rush him onto the field. And for a quarterback that does have areas to develop, that might be the absolute best thing for him. And so I don't know why he fell. If I had to harbor a guess, it was, like I said, sort of the musical chair situation of it. But in the end, it might be the best thing for Drew Lock, the quarterback.
So just out of my own curiosity, where did you have Daniel Jones ranked in your quarterbacks?
Daniel Jones was 6 for me.
Okay.
I
figured he was the one. When you said that Lock was your number 3, I figured you had Murray and Hankins ahead of him.
Yeah, it was Murray, Haskins, Lock, Rypien, Greer, then Jones.
Okay.
And I mean, we don't have to spend too much time on Daniel Jones. I just was not. I thought he could do some nice things in like a limited schematic type of offense. When you see a guy run 72.6% of his dropbacks or 0 to 1 step reads, i.e. 0 to 1 step drops, i.e. they're 1 read type throws, that gets to a schematic limitation that isn't going to work in the National Football League. And so there's a developmental curve in place with him. And plus, when you're drafted a quarterback because of who his coach was, it's easy to look at Cutcliffe and say, oh, well, he coached Peyton and Eli, and they were great, so obviously Daniel Jones is going to be great. And it's like, well, he coached Heath Schuler and Sean Renfree and Thaddeus Lewis too. Like, are we really going to put all our eggs in the Cutcliffe basket?
Right.
Because I think Eli and Peyton, I could have coached them, and I think they would have turned out okay. And so, you know, there were reasons why I was shying away from Daniel Jones. Now, look, Giants drafted him. I woke up the morning of the draft being told that some other AFC teams surely had Daniel Jones as their QB1 as well. And so another situation where with those of us on the outside seeing what we see, we don't like a guy, but the league with the access to the information that they do, they just have a different view of it. And that's sort of the difference between what we can do on the outside and what they can do when they have all the information they do.
Well, before we get to our next quarterback, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about Joe Flacco.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, and welcome back. We have Mark Schofield joining us to talk about the Denver Bronco quarterbacks and what we can expect from them a little bit and what they bring to the table. And now we're getting to the maybe, I mean, almost certainly, unless there's an injury or he just falls flat on his face, but probably the starting quarterback of the Broncos for 2019, and Joe Flacco. Traded a 4th-round pick for this guy. He's been in the league for 11 years with the Ravens. We don't need to talk about that 2012 season. I think most Bronco fans want to forget about that. But here's a guy he's won a lot of games in his time in the NFL, and especially early on was one of those guys just viewed as clutch, especially fourth quarter playoffs, all those kind of things. And now he's here in Denver at the age of 34, and he has come in to replace Case Keenum, who has moved on up to Minnesota. Is that right?
Washington,
yeah. Washington.
Yeah, he came from Minnesota.
That's right. Oh, my goodness. Okay. Anyway, Case Keenum gone, Joe Flacco put in. What are the Broncos getting in that kind of comparison from moving from a Case Keenum type offense to a Joe Flacco type offense?
Well, I mean, I think you're probably getting a couple of different things. You're getting, I'd say, I don't know if aggressive is the right word, but a more willing quarterback to take some risks with the football, appropriate risks. So appropriate aggression might be a good phrase for that in Flacco. He's much more willing to push the ball downfield at times. He's much more willing to challenge some windows that maybe Case Keenum perhaps shied away from. I think you're getting a more generally accurate quarterback in a sense. The ball placement, I think, is more consistent with Flacco. I think you're getting generally a better decision maker, although there are times when Flacco, you sort of wonder if he's got the reputation as a guy that's just looking for PI flags downfield. And that might be sort of a facet of being a Patriots fan. Or certainly, knowing some Ravens fans, because I do live in the Maryland area. I'm here in Maryland, and I have a lot of friends who are Ravens fans, and I watch games with them, and I needle them at times about Flacco's willingness to look for a flag at times. But look, that's the way the game is played in today's National Football League, and so I understand it. I think what's interesting about Flacco is, there was a stretch 2 years ago when his numbers just were not great at all. And you almost started to wonder if he was done. I mean, you look at, there's the 2017 season, you look at adjusted net yards per attempt, which I think the more we look at it is a pretty good metric to not fully understand and encapsulate an entire quarterback season, but it's a pretty good barometer. And you look at Flacco posting an adjusted net yards per attempt of just 4.71 over the 16-game stretch in 2017. And that was best for 29th of the 34 quarterbacks that qualified in this statistic. He was above such illustrious quarterback talents as C.J. Beathard, Tom Savage, Trevor Siemian, Brett Hundley, and Deshaun Kaiser. And yeah, that was Simeon's last season in Denver. So I'm sorry, guys. But I mean, that's not great, And part of that was a sense that, the offense they were running they were checking it down a lot. He was checking it down a lot. He was coming back from injury. And so my expectations were somewhat measured for him last year. And I think what we saw from him last year was twofold. One, he was still dealing with injuries and he had the hip thing come back a bit. And two, there was an element where he was looking over his shoulder. There was a lot of excitement about Lamar Jackson. And we saw how that sort of ended up. But Flacco, to his credit, didn't play particularly bad. I mean, the adjusted net yards per attempt went up to 5.96, which again, not great, but it was his best since 2014. And so you saw him, get a little bit better. His yards per attempt of 6.5, that was his best since, again, 2015. So they were taking a little bit more chances downfield. It wasn't so much the conservativeness that we saw with him in the two prior seasons. And so maybe he's getting his groove back for the position, feeling a little bit healthier until he had the hip injury come back, taking some more chances with the ball downfield a little bit. And so I think the ultimate question for Denver fans is, what quarterback are you getting? Are you getting the 2013, 2014 Joe Flacco, or are you getting the guy we saw, the injury type seasons when he was struggling a little bit?
Yeah, and I'm definitely excited to see him revitalized here. And I mean, before he got hurt last year, I feel like his game, and we had Derek Klassen on here couple months ago, but talking about his short game and, iron sharpens iron, and Flacco was playing some of his better ball since Gary Kubiak was his offensive coordinator last year. So maybe we'll see that again this year, although, little different offense and different situation here. But I do think that the Broncos, there is something to be said about the potential weapons he has around him, because I know the Ravens had a very solid offensive line and defense with Flacco, but as far as, especially wide receivers, but weapons. I mean, I know they threw a lot of resources at tight end, but I mean, since Dennis Pitta, it's been a bunch of mediocrity there, in my opinion, on the offense outside of the offensive line. So what do you think about the situation here in Denver, not only for Flacco, but for Locke and everything around those guys?
I mean, I think they've put together a nice core group of skill position players. You look at Sonny, you look at Sanders, you look at Hamilton, who I liked when he was coming out. I've got a chance to study him a little bit when I was looking at Trace McSorley, of course, and adding the tight end, Noah Fant, who I think is going to thrive in this offense. I think they've got a pretty good group of skill set players that fit well for what we expect this offense to look like. I was on, the night of the draft, I was on the Audible Live, Sigmund Bloom, Matt Waldman, and we were talking about how the Noah Fant fit in Denver was going to be perfect. I was on another fantasy podcast, and I've been telling anybody, look, get yourself some Noah Fant shares in fantasy this year, because I think he's going to thrive in this offense, and he's certainly going to thrive with Joe Flacco, because we know throughout the course of his time, Flacco loves to throw to the tight ends. I mean, whether it's seam routes, whether it's crossing routes off of boot, whether it's sail concepts where you're flooding one side of the field or the other, hitting the tight end on the out route, why sail? He loves to throw to tight ends. And I think that's why, draft season is that one of those, if not the only time of the year, the football season, the football calendar, where you truly get a window into the thinking of an organization, from how they view their rosters to what they want to do schematically to how they're going to approach things in the years ahead, not just, 1 year ahead, but 2 and 3 years down the road. And when you sort of bring in, the offensive coordinator that we expect, Scangarello is going to run this sort of Kubiak-esque kind of offense. When you draft the tight end that is going to be that move type tight end that fits in that kind of offensive system, to pair him with a quarterback that's a fit for that kind of offense, it just shows you that they have a plan in place. And with some teams, you don't know if there's a plan. We've been talking about the Giants a little bit, winking a nod to them. But here with Denver, you see that there does seem to be a plan in place as to how to get this offense productive in year one, right now, and then eventually down the road when they transition from Joe Flacco to Drew Lock. And so, again, we were talking about before the show started, John Elway deserves a lot of credit for how he handled this draft process, because I think, doing what they did, it seems that there's a clear plan in place for how this team can be successful in the year ahead and then the next 2 years down the line.
Yeah, and I think something that we didn't touch on here, but I don't think the national media is making enough of a hoopla about the addition of, I think this offseason's key addition of any team, honestly, Mike Munchak coming over to the Denver Broncos. I mean, talk about a top 2, top 3 offensive line coach. Its offensive line is, I feel like it's at a premium every single year, even more so. And obviously Dante Scarnecchia is a god. I don't know if an assistant coach will get in the Hall of Fame, but if anybody should, it's probably him. But Mike Munchak is, he's nipping at the heels, and his effect on the offensive line for the Broncos, I think, is something that is not, I don't think enough people are talking about it.
No, and it's a very good point, because, we look at the way that they're going to need to sort of structure this offensive line, because you're obviously going to have a lot of outside zone stuff with Lindsey. You're going to want to build the boot action off of that. That's what we expect this offense to, we expect it to operate. The coaching of the offensive line is so critical into developing that zone scheme, that outside zone scheme, because the timing, the footwork, the precision, everything moving in concert, that starts with the offensive line coach. And so having somebody with his background, his pedigree, his ability to coach an offensive line is going to be critical to how this offense is going to run, because if everything sort of stems off their ability to run that play, then you got to be able to get it right.
And Flacco and Drew Lock specifically, if I'm recalling Pro Football Focus correctly, Drew Lock was one of the best quarterbacks in this last draft class as far as ability when kept clean. And also Flacco, not the most mobile guy anymore, but when he's kept clean and he's able to maneuver that pocket, he can still be pretty deadly. Yeah.
You're going to want to keep these guys clean. Flacco, obviously, for some of the reasons we've talked about. And then, look, if Drew Lock is going to see the field early, you're going to want to keep the pressure away from him, because one of the ways to get to rookie quarterbacks and get them to make mistakes is by pressuring them. And so, yeah, this offensive line, if Denver's going to have a kind of season that I think their fans are hoping for, the offensive line is going to have to play a huge role.
So I have 2 more questions about Flacco, and then whatever Nick has left. But why do you think the Ravens are ready to move on? Do they really believe that much in their new guy? Or is it a little bit of injury, a little bit of age, a little bit of contract? What is it, all of that, I guess?
I think sort of all of the above would apply here. I think that there was a growing sense in Baltimore that because of the contract, because of the lack of production we had seen from Joe Flacco last couple of years, that it would be time to explore moving on. And anytime you draft a quarterback in the first round, there's going to be, like we talked about, that set of expectations. When the player struggles, the team struggles, whatever, you're going to want to see that other guy take the field, even if he's not completely ready. When you add in the factor that, Flacco got hurt, and Lamar Jackson was their next guy, their next man up, that's certainly added to it. And they saw enough from Lamar Jackson. They got to the playoffs. And yes, they lost that first round game, but you could see in that second half when they became more of a passing team, they got themselves back in it. And the defense obviously played a role, but they had seen enough to realize that You put all the pieces together, the lack of production at times, the injury history, the contract, the fact that Lamar Jackson was producing, we could turn this offense over to him. And the time was right to sort of move on from Joe Flacco. And so I think it was sort of an all of the above type of situation. It wasn't just one thing. It was just all of these factors led to Baltimore moving in this direction.
And then my final question here, how far do you think the Broncos can really get with Flacco at the helm? Do you view him as a true viable playoff caliber kind of quarterback, or is it just kind of at that point in his career now, especially contract wise? I mean, he's still making pretty good money this year. Yeah. That they just can't surround him with enough talent because, his rookie contract, they were in the playoffs every single season.
Yeah.
Started paying him and nothing happened after that, really.
I think if you sort of look at, the buckets that you can sort of put quarterbacks into, I think it was Sam Monson over at Pro Football Focus who was tweeting about this in the sort of Dak Prescott realm. But if there's like, a tier of quarterbacks that's like elite quarterbacks that like no matter what, like you pay these guys. And then the next tier might be, quarterbacks that you win because of like they could do enough to sort of get a team over the line. And then quarterbacks that you just sort of win with is sort of that third tier where you've got to have some sort of help around them. I think Flacco is in that sort of third tier. He's a quarterback that you win with. He's going to need some help. I think if you look at least with what he was playing last year and what he has now, I think there's probably more talent around him now than what he had in Baltimore last year. I think Baltimore made some nice additions at the wide receiver spot, but I think, Denver has some more weapons for him now. And so I think you can win with him. It's just a matter of, okay, you look at the rest of the AFC West. Obviously, this is Kansas City. Obviously, there's Chargers who are coming off, a playoff season for them. And Oakland, look, 3 first-round picks. Like maybe they put it together this year. AFC West on paper right now looks like a tough division. And so you wonder if a quarterback that you win with and Joe Flacco is still going to be good enough to get you to the playoffs, or are you going to be like a 7-9, 8-8, 9-7 type of season? And in this division, you could see it where a good season for them might be 9-7, but that's not going to be good enough to get you to the playoffs. And it's going to have to take some defensive performances. It's going to have to take the run game being good. I don't think Flacco at this point of his career is good enough to do it on his own. I think it's a quarterback situation that you win with, not a guy that gets you there, a guy that you win because of.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And I definitely we're running along. What's new? Talking football, talking quarterbacks right. With Mark Schofield. It's always great, but your quarterback 4. I definitely want to hear a little bit about this. I mean, maybe he doesn't even make the team. I do think that, the Broncos reports are that they used a 6th-round pick and a 7th-round pick to trade up for wide receiver Juwan Winfrey. But with the 7th-round pick, they were planning on using it on Brett Rypien, and they ended up getting him as an undrafted free agent anyway. And I think he's the highest paid undrafted free agent in the history of the organization. Granted, there's some inflation with the cap over time, but still, the Broncos wanted this guy. They got him, and you saying that he was your quarterback 4, rated higher than the number 6 overall pick, Daniel Jones. But my ears are perked up. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on this quarterback. And a guy like Easton Stick gets drafted who, I think he's maybe a slot receiver in the end. I don't know. He had amazing numbers at the combine with his agilities, but Brett Rypien, undrafted quarterback, but somebody that deserves our attention.
Yeah, I think so. And, I had been studying this kid since his freshman year at Boise State. I first wrote about him that season. And, over the course of his career, you saw in Brett Rypien the ability to do sort of some of those small things that we were talking about with Locke that matter at the quarterback position. You want to talk about manipulation, like that's a box that he checks. We talked about how quarterback is a sort of huddle to whistle position. Well, that's another box he checks. One of my absolute favorite plays from him was a play against San Diego State, a game that they lost, but it was a 3rd and 8. He saw the blitz come on pre-snap. He changes the protection. He brings the tight end in to block up the blitz. They still miss it anyway in front of him, and he knows he's going to get hit, and he hands in the pocket and delivers a strike on an out route for a first down on a 3rd and 8. And that's stuff you have to do in the NFL, those little things. And he does this all the time. You see him, delivering throws, opposite field throws from the left hash to the right sideline with sufficient velocity. You see him doing those little things, handing in the pocket when he knows he's going to get hit, that matter. that inspire people. I mean, when you see, you miss a block and your quarterback takes a shot but still makes the play, you're going to want to go play for that guy. And that's kind of some of the stuff we were talking about with Drew Lock and inspiring those around you to play better. And when you add all of that together, I saw the experienced, refined pocket passer type quarterback that I thought this class didn't really have. Maybe you could say Haskins brought some of that to the table, and but the experience factor, I think, was huge with him. I mean, you're looking at a guy that started, 140 games in his career, started like 55, 53 games, something like that. If you're somebody that puts a lot of stock in the sort of Parcells rules, those 7 things that he looked for in evaluating quarterbacks, he and Ryan Finley were the two that checked off all 7 boxes. And I know it's harder to find guys that will start 30 games and win 23 because a lot of these guys, Murray and Haskins were one and done. But if those things matter to you, then you would look at a guy like Brett Rypien rather favorably. And it's interesting, and Scagarillo had comments at minicamp where he talked about how both Rypien and Locke started a ton of games, won a lot of games, and you had a lot of film to evaluate them on. And so if you're looking at maybe the Broncos being a team that would look at those sort of Parcells rules and factor them in, well, there's a guy that checks all 7 boxes. And so I think, again, you put it all together, and I saw a refined pocket passer that did the little things, that could manipulate defenders with his eyes, and I really liked this kid. Now, I knew that the NFL didn't feel the same way for the most part. I mean, he did not get the Senior Bowl invite. I mean, he had a better week from what I was told by people that were down there at the East-West Shrine game than Easton Stick, and Easton Stick got drafted and Rypien didn't. When you look at, for example, the Pro Football Weekly Draft magazine, which I was a part of, but Greg Gabriel, former scouting director for the Bears for 9 years or so, has a lot of people that he knows in and around the league. He obviously knows what NFL teams are looking for. Out of the 17 quarterbacks he listed in the magazine, Brett Rypien was not one of them. And I talked to people down at the Senior Bowl about, how come you didn't invite my boy? And they're just like, we had a lot of quarterbacks this year. And okay, but it's clear that the league just felt differently about him. But it only takes one team. And what's interesting about, being an undrafted free agent, when it gets in late in day 3, if you're a guy that's still out there, you almost would rather be an undrafted free agent because you can pick your spot. And sometimes you get guaranteed money better than these draft picks get. And that was the case with Rypien. I was surprised when he picked Denver because, look, they had Kevin Hogan. They had Garrett Grayson on the roster already. They had drafted Drew Lock. Now you're going to be quarterback 5? Well, they immediately cut Garrett Grayson. So now you're down to 4. He's a better quarterback than Kevin Hogan. I think with the guaranteed money, that's a sign that he's at least going to be a practice squad guy. And so maybe he did pick the right spot. And we're hearing that he felt really comfortable with Skag, and maybe this is the right landing spot for him. And obviously, look, I don't want to be wrong. I mean, nobody wants to be wrong. And so the fact that I might have him as my QB4, I would love for it to see him completely pan out for him. But he was a guy that I was very high on. We'll see how it turns out. But yeah, I mean, those were some of the things that I liked about him.
I know you're not supposed to read too much into OTA practices, but they did say he really outplayed Hogan today. And especially with his ball placement, that was one of the things that they kept talking about was he just seemed to have the ball right where it needed to be. So I think the Broncos, I mean, with how much they paid him, it sounds like there probably were a lot of other teams after him.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that there were teams after him at that point because, when you're getting into sort of the undrafted free agent realm, like it's hit and miss what you're going to be able to find. But to get somebody with that sort of pedigree, that background, that level of experience as an undrafted free agent at the quarterback position, I think is a pretty good opportunity for an organization. And, what was interesting in, again, talking about these two guys was, when I had some time on my hands, and so I did sort of an accuracy and ball placement charting exercise, going back through 6 games of 2 quarterbacks each. And it was Lock and Rypien. I mean, you guys, I don't know how it just turned out that, these guys, QBs 3 and 4, you guys draft both of those guys. And now with this little exercise I did, and you saw both of these guys, pretty impressive ball placement. And so to hear that, Hogan and Rypien in terms of ball placement, at least for one day of OTAs, Rypien was, outperforming him in that area. I'm not surprised. I mean, I was Very impressed with his ball placement and his accuracy to all levels of the field. I do think that with Rypien, there were probably two areas of concern. One was, look, not the most athletic quarterback. And part of the fact, the offshoot of him being willing to take hits in the pocket and things like that is because maybe he didn't have the ability to sort of escape. Maybe he lacks that escapability, and maybe teams are looking for a more athletic quarterback now as opposed to a pure pocket passer. But I think he will be perfectly fine for what Denver wants to run. And I do think the 9-inch hands played a role. And it's interesting that, look, Locke and Rypien have 9-inch hands, both of them. And I'm typically not a hand size matters guy, but similar to the discussion with mechanics, if you can find instances where the hand size does seem to factor into things, that may be a concern. And when Locke measured at 9-inch hands, I went back to his game against Arkansas because one of the situations you'll see it matter is in weather. If the ball's coming out funny, if he can't grip the ball, look, I have tiny hands. Whenever it rained, I was useless as a quarterback because I couldn't hold the ball. Locke's game against Arkansas was cold, wet, rainy. He was zipping it all over the place. Looked fine. No fumbles, wasn't getting, hit in the pocket and losing the ball. But with Rypien, the Mountain West Championship game against Fresno State, it was wet, it was snowy. It seemed like they almost took the ball out of his hands in that game because they didn't throw it as much. And so it did seem like it impacted him in weather. There were fumble situations with him. They had a game I think, sophomore year against Wyoming. They were number 13 in the country. It was tied late, 36-36. They're inside their own 20-yard line or so. And he gets bumped in the pocket, fumbles, and they lose on a safety as a result. And so I think teams probably looked at this and said, the 9-inch hands, with Locke, it's not an issue because, we've got evidence where it's not a factor. But with Rypien, it's showing up. And it's been a problem at times. And so maybe teams thought, we're not going to draft this guy, but if he happens to fall to us or we can grab him as a UDFA, then fine. And maybe that played a role. I don't know. But I'd have to think there was something because it's clear that while myself and you mentioned Derek Clausen, he was QB4 for him. A lot of people liked him on the outside. NFL just didn't seem to like him as much.
And I got to ask, some people are already predicting the worst in Denver, a little bit of PTSD from the whole Paxton Lynch and Trevor Siemian thing. And you said you had Locke over Rypien, which is good. Otherwise, I'd have been a little bit panicked that we're going down this road again. But why is it that you think, talk me out of it? Why is we shouldn't be worried about Rypien in that way with Drew Lock there? I mean, maybe don't lie to me, if that's something we should be worried about. But as far as, this you have this guy you took early and you're hoping he'll be the guy, but yeah, you have another guy behind him. So talk me off the ledge there. I mean, it's a good thing to have more quality arms than not, but the whole Paxton Lynch, Trevor Siemian dynamic has me a little bit of PTSD.
Right. And I understand why, but let's revisit some of the things we talked about. The Senior Bowl week, I think, speaks volumes about Drew Lock and how he's going to handle the situation because, again, he had all the eyes on him. And he handled that week from the opening press conference through the game incredibly well. I mean, you talk to anybody down there, he had the best week or one of the best weeks out of all these quarterbacks. And he lived up to that moment. And it sort of shows you that, look, he's not somebody that's going to shirk his responsibilities. You look at the work he's been putting in with Jordan Palmer, and it's already paying off. So it gets to that coachability. And it does seem like he's the type of person that's going to take it upon himself to go about the business of being a professional quarterback. And I think perhaps more than anything else, that was the thing that sort of held Paxton Lynch back. I mean, we've all heard the rumors and the rumblings about him playing video games and be more interested in that than anything else. And look, I love playing video games too, but when you get a job to do, you got to go out there and do it. And it seems like, Drew Lock certainly has that background to him where he's going to, focus on the task at hand. And look, the talent obviously, there is a little bit of a talent gap, obviously, between Locke and Rypien. I mean, I think Rypien is a more complete quarterback, but I think Drew Lock has more talent. I think he has the higher ceiling. And so I think this might be a situation where, if Flacco doesn't quite pan out, Locke is going to be the guy. And now you've got a guy, Brett Rypien, behind him that can be that sort of long-term backup spot starter type guy that I think most teams need to have right now. I mean, I don't think organizations can view it as we just need one quarterback and we're done. You need two guys, and you need a guy behind your starter that can come in and hold down the fort and keep the offense moving and get you 60, 70, 80% of what the starter gives you. you need to have two solid quarterback options. And I think by getting both Locke and Rypien, they've set themselves up, the Denver Broncos have, for having those two guys for the next 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, perhaps.
I think there was something I heard that over half the starting quarterbacks last year at least missed one game.
Yeah. I mean, look, in this day and age, between the lack of practice time and, that has a trickle-down effect on whether guys miss blocking assignments, guys miss protection calls, guys just land funny. Like, strange things can happen. I mean, you don't want to have a situation where if your top guy goes down, it's a lost season. And again, we were talking before we started recording about, with some head coaches and some general managers, like if you have a lost season, it's okay because look, they're established. They've won a ton of games. Like if Tom Brady goes down and the Patriots finish, 2-14 next year, Bill Belichick isn't getting fired. But with some organizations and some front offices, like if you have a lost season, heads will roll. And so you need to have that sort of plan B and sometimes a plan C because you might be on quarterback 3 before you know it. Just look, Redskins play just down the road from where I am right now. And look at what happened to them last year. They were on a guy that was going to be playing in the AAF before the season was over. And so you need to have a couple of different options behind your starter because things can go wrong in a hurry if that guy goes down. And so I think Drew Lock is the team's quarterback in the future. But obviously I think a lot of Brett Rypien. And I think it's smart to get in another potential backup guy behind him because eventually this will be Drew Lock's team and Brett Rypien can be that guy behind him for the next 6, 7, 8 years.
And being a Pats fan, you should know the value of a good backup quarterback. You can always trade them for a future pick, maybe, better return on investment.
Look, and 3 years from now, if Denver wants to flip, Brett Rypien to the New England Patriots for a second rounder, I would be completely fine with that.
Well, let's hold you to that right now.
I don't know. They got their boy Jarrett Stidham there, so
yeah, they got their
future.
They got their future, and I will say, it is nice that my Twitter header photo now is a picture of me and the new Patriots quarterback. I mean, that is kind of cool. I mean, It got me some bonus points, some style points back home when that happened. So yeah, it got me some likes on Instagram, which is always cool.
Yeah, for sure. And the Broncos country, I feel like they don't appreciate the backup. I mean, obviously everyone's always clamoring for the next backup quarterback to get in there because the starter is never good enough. That's just the nature of anything. But the Broncos Super Bowl run in 2015, I don't think that happens without Brock Osweiler. I know everyone likes to talk bad about him, but without him coming in and controlling the offense for, 6 games, and the Broncos are still able to win. I think they 5-1 in that stretch or something and get the number 1 seed. And the rest is history.
Yeah, so. That was a critical stretch for Denver. You look at what Osweiler did during that period of time. They had some wins in that game that really were huge for them. I think one of them was a Patriots game.
That was an incredible game. No offense to you.
That game.
Amazing.
Yeah, and that win, gets you home field.
Yep. And that's
what happened in the AFC Championship game. That was at home against New England. New England struggles to play on the road. That gets you to a Super Bowl. And so, yeah, I think Osweiler does deserve a chunk of credit for that little stretch. And yeah, I know, like in most NFL cities, like the backup quarterback tends to be the most popular person in town. We've seen this play out with Philadelphia most recently where, he wins a Super Bowl. Then the next year he gets them to the playoffs when it looked like they weren't going to get into the playoffs. Now we'll see what it's like for Nick Foles as the guy. Like it changes the calculus, but you do need in today's NFL some solid backup options behind the starter. A fun exercise for people to do is take any team and rank all, 20 rank every position, go too deep on offense and defense in terms of importance. And you might say, look, quarterback is obviously the most important position. And then maybe you might get to, left tackle or whatever. How quickly do you get to backup quarterback? You might get to backup quarterback before some starters because if you lose QB1, it's more important who's taking the snaps other than, who the backup defensive inside, the backup 3 tech is. And so it's an interesting exercise that I sometimes throw out there when you can see just how important QB2 actually is.
Although I will counter that with Tom Moore, who asked why isn't the backup quarterback getting any snaps? It's because if Peyton Manning goes down, we are effed.
And we don't practice effed. I get it. That's always the sort of counterpoint to it.
Yeah.
I get that. But I think in today's NFL, you need a QB2. And, maybe part of that is selfish in a sense, because the fact that I can come out here and say you need a QB2 means people pay attention to the quarterbacks that are drafted on day 3 or are undrafted free agents. So it keeps me in business as well. So there's a bit of a selfish, self-serving nature to it, I think.
Also, if you have a QB2, odds are that means you are okay with that QB1. So that's a little bit of life on the bright side there for the Pats in that regard. Yeah. But before we get you out of here, just general overall thoughts on the Broncos draft class. I thought we talked about it. They did pretty well. Noah Fant, Dalton Reisner, Drew Lock, Draymond Jones, Justin Hollins, and Juwan Winfrey. Undrafted free agents. Malik Reed's the guy that's already getting some hype. He was doing really well. The edge rusher from Nevada. Thoughts on the general draft class and the direction of this team?
No, I think Elway had a fantastic draft. I always love seeing teams sort of work their boards, and they come down to 20. They get the pick next year. They get Noah Fant, perfect fit for their offense. And then at 41 and 42, they get guys that were talked about as first-round picks. Reisner got a lot of late first-round buzz late in the draft process. I thought New England might take him at 32 if he was there. Locke is a guy that people thought they were going to pick at 10. You get him at 42. I think that's a fantastic pick. And Jermont Jones was a guy that was also getting some sort of maybe early day 2 type buzz to get him at 71. I think those first 4 picks were fantastic, and then you get into the 5th and 6th round, you're looking at guys that, maybe can contribute on special teams and things like that. But if you get the first 4 picks right, you've had a pretty good draft. And I think Elway, at least sitting here right now, seems to have done that.
All right. Well, Mark Schofield, thank you for joining us today. Anything you want to promote before we get you on out of here?
No, just like I said, guys, always a blast being on with you, both of you guys. Always a fun time. We always go long, but that's good because there's stuff to talk about. People want, you can check me out on Twitter at Mark Schofield. That's the best place to keep up with me.
All right, Mark. Well, thank you again as always, and we'll have you on again soon. But hopefully, maybe we won't be talking about first round quarterbacks next year.
Yeah, if we're doing this conversation again next year, man, I missed on a lot of stuff in that case. Let's put it that way.
Hey, but that's live and learn, right? That's the imperfect science.
It is an imperfect science, and we learn from our mistakes.
Exactly. All righty, and that was Mark Schofield. And man, what a great guy! I know he's just he's off now, so I don't want to get his ego too big when he was on here, but really appreciate him coming on. This is his 4th time coming on the show with us, and always a lot of insight. And you can tell that he's a guy that I would like to sit down at a bar with and kick back a few drinks and probably talk football for about 4 or 5 hours.
I think if we didn't have a timer on our show, we would probably go that.
Oh man,
I don't think we would mind. Maybe our listeners might be like, "Come on, guys, shut up by now."
Yeah.
But no, we could talk these, especially quarterbacks, all day long, because there's so much that goes into the picture of the quarterback. And I love just getting a little bit of his insight, and especially because, he was a quarterback.
Yeah.
So who knows quarterbacks better than a quarterback and what they go through, what to look for, all those kind of things. So I love having him on the show, especially when we're talking about these kind of things. And I don't know whether to get excited about his thoughts on Rypien or, like you said, a little bit nervous.
I think the only way to look at it right now from our perspective is excited, because the nervous part is like, well, what if he works out too well? That's just looking about it that way. It sounds silly,
right?
I have to tell it myself that way because it sounds silly that way, but it really is there. So I do believe in Drew Lock. I think that I don't know who was a bigger Drew Lock fan first. Was it you or me? I definitely was out of love. In love would be too strong, but kind of a ebb and flow. But I feel like you are in.
I guess I'm one of those.
Cam is in, but
I'm that hopeless optimist.
Yeah,
that I just think, okay, we got to finally found our guy, because I can't do the go between John Elway and Peyton Manning stretch again.
Oh yeah,
waiting to find your quarterback, and I just part of it is with Locke. I just love his personality, man.
I do too.
It's just he's one of those guys I'd want to go sit down and have a beer and talk football with. And I think he's a really down to earth guy. I think he's a guy that I know is going to work hard for the team. And yeah, not everything's perfect, but he's just an easy guy to cheer for. And so I can't wait to see what he can do with the Broncos. And it's nice. I hate to always hype up the OTAs or rookie minicamp and things like that, but he is getting a lot of eyes going, there's a lot at this kid. And, it's nice to at least hear positive things about a quarterback. We talked about it on our last show of Paxton Lynch would have the throw of the day, but that'd be about it.
Yeah.
And so when you start hearing that he's doing some other things that are good, it makes it that much better. And I love when Mark was talking about just his fit with what the Broncos want to do with this offense of get vertical. You sent me that article, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more as the offseason goes on of what this offense is going to look like. But you sent me that article of Kyle Shanahan and some media person coming up saying, hey, I'd like to do an interview with you. And he's like, well, what do you want to talk about? And he's like, well, I want to talk about the West Coast offense. And he's like, we don't run an effing West Coast offense. And I love that comment by Kyle Shanahan, but it's different. There's a lot of things. I mean, there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences between what the West Coast offense requires and what Kyle Shanahan, Gary Kubiak, Mike Shanahan, and I hope Rich Scangarello as well, because I think it does fit well with Joe Flacco and does fit well with Drew Lock. And so those kind of things, I mean, just gets me hyped up to see a quarterback that fits the scheme, because we had last year with Case Keenum, he was not a good fit with that scheme. That was a bad marriage right there. And
the lack of play action. I mean, watching the Rams, obviously they didn't do great in the Super Bowl, but missing Cooper Kupp, Todd Gurley kind of wearing down, and Pat's had 2 weeks to prepare for him. But we're getting to the point where I kind of have a love-hate relationship with analytics, but the analytics say if you're passing the ball, you should probably be doing play action. And something that doesn't make any sense, which analytics doesn't back up, which maybe it doesn't make sense because people think it happens. I'm not explaining this well, but people think you need to run to establish the play action pass, but all the data says that's not true. You just need to frickin' play action pass, because the threat of it alone, they don't even have to buy it. They're still going to get sucked in. You're going to hold them for a second.
Right.
So that's, I don't know, the amount of play action pass with Case Keenum, he needed it. And it's going to be a huge part of this offense as well. I mean, you talk about the articles we sent you, but the play action pass is what's going to open up the offense, the pass game, what can afford you to take more vertical shots. And hopefully you have a complementary run game, but still you got to pass it to win in today's game. So it'll be fun. And I really would love to get an expert on the West Coast offense in here. Maybe we'll just get more of an X's and O person, but because it's all projection at this point too. So it's the unknown of what Scangarello is going to be. But as far as the Shanahan offense goes, you're maximizing the play action, the zone stretch, and the kind of taking the ball. It's so complicated.
Yeah.
It's a more vertical, aggressive offense, and it's paired with a zone blocking scheme, but it asks less mentally of the quarterback than say what Walsh asked, if that makes sense. The reads are simpler. They're more half-field reads. They're more dependent on pushing the ball vertically and creating space that way, where there still be some horizontal concepts, but it's more of that vertical concept with making it easier on the quarterback, half-field reads, using the athleticism, the bootleg. I mean, I remember even reading it, and we were talking about it was Kyle Shanahan and Mike Shanahan, and they tried to integrate the spread kind of shotgun concepts with Robert Griffin there at the Redskins. And I'm like, well, we're not really running the under center, so we can't hold that backside defender with a bootleg, so to speak. But what if we just implement that play action as far as a zone read from the quarterback, and that will hold that backside defender? Mind blown. How did I never even think of that before as a thing? It's so obvious now in hindsight. But it's oh, duh. So really fun. I'm excited about this offense, and we'll be talking about the direction of the offense, hopefully get an expert on here, like we said, but it's hard not to think that this is trending in the right direction with Munchak coming in, new tight end weapon, Sutton and Hamilton a year older. I'm really excited about those two this year, and a more thorough shotgun approach to the quarterback position with more talent in the three guys that they have in since Peyton Manning and Brock Osweiler in the quarterback room.
Right. And something else that I really liked that he talked about was he said that there are a lot of players. Well, he didn't say this, but I mean, I know of a few players that really talked about Rich Scangarello being a guy that impressed them. I mean, I know Noah Fant was very impressed by him. Rypien obviously was impressed by him. I know Drew Lock was impressed by him. And there's others out there that actually really like talking to this guy and just hearing his thoughts on the game. And so when you have that kind of guy, it just gets you excited that other players gravitate to what they're doing. And so, I mean, I guess it makes me a little bit less nervous about what Scangarello is going to look like. I still need to see him call a game. I mean, that's always it's easy to figure out some practice things and do some of the X's and O's and things like that, but to actually call a game, like this is what we need to do, this is how we need to set up things. I mean, that's one thing. I hate to give the Patriots too many compliments, but Bill Belichick is always playing chess when everybody else is playing checkers. Yeah. And he just knows how to set things up to really make a team think that they're going to do one thing and then do the exact opposite. And so I'm hoping Scangarello can be that kind of guy when we're talking about play calling. But again, until we actually see it on the field, it's hard to really judge. It's the same with all these rookie players that we have that we've been talking about since the draft and before the draft. I mean, until they prove it on the field, they're just a possibility. Yeah.
No, you're right. And I mean, we're still projecting the Scangarello offense. How will it be different than the Shanahan? You know, like McVay is a disciple of this Shanahan offense as well. So, and Shanahan and McVay, while they run similar offenses, they have their own wrinkles. So it'll be interesting, but I'm very excited about it. And, you know, it all, we obviously talk a lot of roster building philosophy, theory and whatnot, but I had 4 main pillars of team success where you have to have these 4 things set up to really compete year in and year out. And while I do think there are 4, it might actually be 2. It might be the coaching staff and the quarterback. And you'd be hard pressed to get me to think that the Broncos did not improve drastically there this offseason with the coaching staff, not only Fangio, but the guys around him as well. And the combination of Flacco, Luck, and Rypien. So 11 wins over the last 2 years, not great, but I really do believe, and I'm you know this, I'm not a fanboy when it comes to this. I am pretty hardcore with my opinion. I'll say it that way. And I wouldn't say I'm a pessimist in that regard, but like I definitely try to fight optimism. I'm really fun at parties, but it does really feel like everything's trending in the right direction, and that gives me hope for the first time in this team since literally 2015.
Right. Like you said, I mean, this is the first time I felt like they really married a lot of things together.
And you can see the direction.
Right. I mean, this is part of it with like Paxton Lynch. He didn't fit with Kubiak.
No.
Kubiak didn't even want him.
No.
So, that has to play into the picture of going, oh my gosh, how could we get this far off? But they did. And thankfully, that's the great thing about the NFL is you fail one year, you can get right back on track the next. And I do feel like the Broncos, like you said, have done a lot to get back on track. And now we just got to see how it all comes together. I mean, they got just a few short months here before the season comes into play. I mean, it feels like it's a long few months. But, I mean, when we're talking about trying to build up a team with so many new players, coaches, all of that, it's a very short window. And so I'm interested to see how that all goes. I loved hearing about Fangio and how he's running OTAs. They said everything just seems so much sharper. All the coaches are talking. Everybody just seems on the same page. And so that's definitely nice to hear. And we'll just have to kind of see from here on out what happens. But I don't know. There's a lot of promise, and it's nice to hear, like I said, with Mark coming on here, that he likes what the Broncos are doing. That gives me a lot more confidence when somebody else outside the Bronco fan base has that kind of perception about them.
Absolutely. Well, that's going to wrap up today's episode of Building the Broncos podcast, powered by Overtime Media. Thanks to Mark for joining us today to talk Broncos quarterbacks in general, and make sure you guys go follow him on Twitter because he's a good guy. And make sure you find him on Twitter at Mark Schofield. You can follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Dumler MHH and myself at Nick Kendell MHH. Also, make sure you head on over to Mile High Huddle, an affiliate of 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports Digital, to find more content covering the Denver Broncos. Head on over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating and a comment, as your support can help us continue to bring you our Denver Bronco deep dives. You can follow the Building the Broncos podcast and all our other great audio content by subscribing to the Huddle Up podcast, wherever you listen to your shows. You can follow us on Twitter at Mile High Huddle and at BTB Football Pod. For Carl, I'm Nick, wrapping up another episode of Building the Broncos podcast. We hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will see you soon. Go Broncos.
You've been listening to Building the Broncos. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.